Today on Touching Lives.
The best this world has to offer you is trash compared to the worst that Jesus can give you. And I'm just telling you, I am so glad every day I wake up, I am so glad to know everybody should be invited to follow Jesus. Anybody that wants to can, and I am so glad I have.
With hope and encouragement for life, this is Touching Lives with James Merritt.
Now, if you were here last week as we started this series, you'll remember Jesus has already found his first missing persons. He had found some fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They were missing people. They were far from God. He invited them to come near to God. And not only did he invite them to come near to God, he invited them to come and to follow him, and amazingly, they did. And when they decided to follow him, he said, look, I want you to understand what I'm asking you to do. I want you to quit fishing for fish, and I want you to start fishing for people. I want you to start looking for missing persons. Well, I'm sure that raised a question. Because, for example, if you were to say to me today, I'd like to take you fishing, which, by the way, ain't going to happen, but if you were to say to me, hey, I'd like to take you fishing, you know the first question I would ask, well, what kind of fish are we going to fish for? And so when Jesus said to these disciples, I don't want you to fish for fish, I want you to fish for people. I want you to start looking for missing persons. They must have asked the question, well, Lord, what kind of missing persons should we go after? What kind of fish should we be looking for? And what they were going to learn and what Jesus was going to teach them and what Jesus was going to show them over the next 3 years absolutely shocked their system to the core. And this is what I want you to take out the door this morning. What you're going to learn today is this: everybody is invited to follow Jesus. Everybody is to be invited to follow Jesus, and anybody can follow Jesus. Everybody's to be invited, and anybody can do it. All right, so let me just make sure you've got it. Who are we to be inviting to follow Jesus? Tell me who. Everybody. And who can if they want to? Anybody, right? So everybody's to be invited, and anybody can do it. And now here's what Jesus is going to do. By the way, if you've got a broad copy of God's Word, we already know we're going to be in one of 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Turn to the Gospel of Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, third book, and I want you to turn to Luke chapter 5. And what you're going to see today is Jesus has just called, if you remember, he has just called these new men to follow him, Andrew, Peter, James, and John. Now he's going to show them what they're to do, and he's going to show them how to do it. And the same way that Jesus did it is the same way we are to do it. Because it's come one, come all. This is what you're going to see this morning. 3 things I want to share with you. Number 1, you're going to learn today we are to ask everyone to follow Jesus. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter where they come from, doesn't matter what their background is. We are to ask everyone to follow Jesus. We're in Luke chapter 5, verse 27. After this, he went out and he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. When Jesus gets to Levi, the disciples kept walking. He just stops, and he's staring at Levi, and he's looking at this guy up and down. Now, you got to keep in mind, at this time, the fame of Jesus is growing, and most probably Levi knew exactly who Jesus was. And then Jesus walks over to Levi and opens his mouth and says the last thing Levi ever thought he'd hear Jesus say, Levi, follow me. I want you, Levi, to become one of my disciples. Now, you have to understand, in the first century, the word disciple didn't mean then what it means to us today. Today, when we think about a disciple, we think about somebody that goes to school and they learn lessons from a teacher. But back then, it didn't mean a learner. It meant an apprentice. A disciple was someone who didn't just learn a skill, he learned a way of life. And so when Jesus said to him, follow me, what he was saying was, I don't want you just to change the way you think, Levi. I want to change the way you live. Levi, I don't want to change you from the outside in. Levi, I want to change you from the inside out. Well, what was even more amazing, both to Levi and the disciples, was this. You know, Jesus was considered a rabbi. In fact, some people called him a rabbi. Rabbis were famous teachers. Well, what you may not understand is, back in the day, rabbis would never ask students to become their disciples. Students would always ask rabbis if they could become their disciples. As a matter of fact, in order to follow a particular rabbi, you had to apply. Just like today, you have to apply to college. You had to send in an application. You had to have a certain GPA. You had to have a certain SAT score. You had to have certain things on your transcript. You had to have a perfect knowledge of the first 5 books of the Bible. As a matter of fact, one of the things you might be asked by a rabbi before he would accept you, he might just pick out a passage of Scripture either in the first 5 books of the Bible and say, all right, recite that passage, and you were supposed to know it by heart. So the selection process was intense. It was meticulous. It was painstaking. You say, well, why would they do it that way? Because the reputation of the rabbi was determined by the quality of the students. So the higher quality student that you allowed into your club, the greater reputation that you had. So Jesus comes along and does something that no other rabbi had ever done and no other rabbi would ever think about doing. He doesn't wait on somebody to ask if they can follow him. He actually does the asking. No application. Just invitation. And the disciples are watching this and they're going, I can't believe what Jesus is doing. We couldn't get over it when he did it for us. Now he's doing it for him. And even though they didn't get it at the time, what Jesus was doing with Levi was exactly what he wanted them to start doing with other people. Calvin Coolidge once said, the business of America is business. Well, I want to tell you something. The business of our church and the business of every church and the business of every follower of Jesus Christ is people. We're in the people business, and specifically, we're in the missing person business. Our number one job, church together and individually, will always be, it's just in our daily living, be out looking for missing persons and inviting them to follow Jesus. Why should we do that? Because everybody's to be invited to follow Jesus, and anybody can follow Jesus. Let's say that together. Everybody is to be invited to follow Jesus, and anybody can follow Jesus. Well, if that wasn't enough to shake the disciples up, and if that wasn't enough to shock the crowd that was watching all this happen, the next thing that happened blew everybody up. Because not only are we going to learn today, we're to ask everybody to follow Jesus. We are to accept anyone that's willing to follow Jesus. Now, this is what's going to blow you away. The first command Jesus ever gave, we know, were 2 words, follow me. We've already seen how unusual his method was, because back in that day, you were to be asked to be followed. You were not to ask people to follow you. But what was just as shocking was not how he did it, but who he invited. Now let's read this verse again. After this, he went out and he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. A tax collector worked for the Roman government. And here's the way the Romans collected their taxes. They would take a district like Palestine, and they would divide it up into several, they'd take a country like Palestine, and they would divide it up into districts, or we call them today counties. So they divide, a country up into different counties. And they would kind of look and see who lived in what county, and they'd say, okay, your county needs to pay this level of tax, your county needs to pay this level of tax, and everybody had a level of tax they had to pay. They had a fixed tax figure they had to pay. And then they would sell the right to collect those taxes to the highest bidder, because you're going to see in a moment, it was you talk about a carpet job. You talk about a money-making deal. The tax collector had the unlimited authority to tax anything he wanted to tax. Didn't matter. If you walked down the road, he could charge you a road tax. If you were pulling a cart, he could count the wheels on your cart. You had to pay a wheel tax. He could look in your bag, and if you had a bottle of wine, you had to pay a wine tax. If you had bread, you had to pay a bread tax. If you had, you wouldn't have peanut butter, but if you had something like that, anything like that, you'd pay a tax. If you had a letter, if you had a private letter, he had the right to open up that letter, and if you were conducting business in that letter, he could tax the letter. So he could charge whatever he wanted to charge over and above what the government required, and he would pocket the profit. So let me put it to you this way. Levi was a missing person that nobody missed. Levi was a missing person that nobody wanted. Tax collectors were so despised, they couldn't even go to church. They were barred from the synagogues. They were excommunicated. Their word was considered so worthless and so useless, they couldn't even testify in a court of law. They were on the same level with robbers and murderers and pimps and prostitutes. When the neighborhood had a neighborhood cookout, they didn't get invited. When the high school reunion got together, they were somehow left off the list. And it gets even worse than that. Most probably his own parents had disowned him. Let me tell you how I know that. He was the black sheep of the family because look at his name. His name was Levi. If you know anything about the name Levi, Levi is the priestly tribe. That's where all the priests came from. And you would only name a child Levi if somebody in your family had already been a priest. So evidently, his father, maybe his grandfather, maybe his great-grandfather were priests. And so when he was born, his parents looked at him and said, you're going to be the next priest. We're going to send you to Bible school. We're going to send you to seminary. You're going to be the priest of the synagogue. You're going to be our pride, and you're going to be our joy. And what does he do? He abandons his family. He abandons his heritage. He abandons his upbringing. He abandons his spiritual background. And of all things, becomes a Roman tax collector. So even the family reunion, he doesn't get to come. And so here's this scene. While other people would walk, and if they even looked at him, they'd curse him, or spit at him, or threaten him. Jesus comes along and says the very same thing he says to these fishermen. Hey, Levi, follow me. Now, Andrew, Peter, and James, and John, they're sitting there and they're thinking, wait a minute. We understand you asking us. I mean, we're good guys. We're Jews. We go to synagogue. We're honest fishermen. We're faithful attenders. We're good people. You just invited a traitor. You just invited a lowlife. You just invited the scum of the earth. How could you do that? And it gets worse. Because if you go to the next chapter, in chapter 6 and verse 15, it says that he also called Simon, who was called the zealot. Now let me tell you about zealots. They were on the other end of the spectrum from the tax collector. Okay, now, I mean, this is so cool. Simon was a freedom fighter. He was a terrorist. He absolutely hated the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, if you had decided you'd had enough of Levi and you were going to hire a hitman to take him out, you would have hired Simon. Simon would have been your man. Oh man, that's what I love. I'll be more than happy to take this guy out. So now all of a sudden, Jesus is pulling these guys together, and in this band of brothers, on the one hand, you've got a tax collector. On the other hand, you've got a terrorist. On the one hand, you've got a traitor. On the other hand, you've got a terrorist. And so not only does Jesus ask the least likely and the least lovely to follow him, he says, you know what? I'm going to bring you guys together. And so I would have loved to have heard this conversation. He goes to Simon. He says, Simon, you're a zealot. You're a freedom fighter. You're a terrorist. You despise Romans. You hate collaborators, and you really hate tax collectors, right? Yes, I do. Will you follow me? Sure. Hey, Matthew, you are a collaborator. You are a tax collector. You work for the Roman empires. You fear and despise guys like Simon. Will you follow me? Yes, Lord. Great. Simon, you room with Levi. Now, how could that happen? How in the world, number one, could Jesus stoop so low to invite one man who was a thief from his own people, and on the other hand, invite a man who would have no qualms about cutting off the head of a Roman baby? How in the world could he do that? It's real simple. Everyone is to be invited to follow Jesus, and anybody can. So, if that lesson didn't blow everybody away, Jesus said, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because not only are we to ask everyone to follow Jesus, not only are we to accept anyone who's willing to follow Jesus, watch this, we are to associate with people who don't follow Jesus. Now I want you to watch how this story winds up. This is good. This is so cool. What happens next to me as I read the story is even more incredible than Levi the tax collector leaving this well-paying job, or this terrorist saying, I'm going to give up all violence, I'm going to follow you. Because look what happens in verse 29. And Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with him. Now here's what had happened. Levi gets up and walks away from this $1 million job, walks away from a job that could set him financially for life. Leaves everything and follows Jesus. He says, Lord, I'm so excited about my new life. I'm so excited about following you. I'm so excited about turning to a new way of living. I'd like to celebrate. And Jesus says, why don't you throw a party? And he says, well, would you come? He said, I'd be glad to. Well, where can I have it? Let's have it at your house. You know, you got this big house you bought with that crooked money. Let's use it for something. So why don't we have it at your house? He says, okay. He said, well, who can I invite? He said, well, invite whoever you want to. He said, well, can I invite my buddies? He said, yeah, sure, invite your buddies. Well, who are his buddies? You know who missing people hang out with? Other missing people. You know who tax collectors hung out with? Other tax collectors. Nobody else would hang out with them. So he says, okay, great. So now you got a room full, a house full of all of these low-down tax collectors, because what he had done was he had thrown a finding missing persons party. Because you see, when you accept the call to follow Jesus, and this is something I didn't learn at first. Jesus does not call us to isolation. He calls us to association. See, here's what's wrong with a lot of us. And me too. I have to fight this. We get saved, and then we start getting into what I call the little holy huddles. And if the only way there's certain qualifications you got to get to. Let me tell you about what you have to do to be a holy in my holy huddle. You want to get in mine? Got to love Jesus, read your Bible, pray, tithe. Be a Georgia Bulldog fan and eat grits. I mean, if you want to be in my holy huddle, that's what you got to do. Right? I mean, because we all get in these, these little holy huddles. Well, the problem was, I grew up thinking the same way you thought. Once I went from being a missing person to a found person, I said, now my job is to avoid other missing people. Jesus says, no. Your job is to go fishing for them. Your job is to go find them. Your job is to invite them to the party. And so you got this big party going on with the most despised, low-life people in all of Israel. And guess what? Jesus is right in the middle of it. I heard someone say, as I was telling you this, someone observed that people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And Jesus liked people who were nothing like him. Now, let me tell you why it's so important that we need to get out of our holy huddles and start associating with missing persons and lovingly and gently and naturally introduce them to Jesus. Let me tell you why. Because when people who are far from God truly meet the Son of God, they want to draw near to God. When people who are far from God truly meet the Son of God, they want to draw near to God. Now, I want to warn you something. Some of you in this room are about to get hit with a rock. I'm just going to be careful. I'm just telling you right now, get ready. Do you know who really hates this kind of talk? Religious people. Church-going people. The big black Bible carrying people. Because listen to what happens next in verse 30. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Now, who are the Pharisees and the scribes? They are the exact opposite of the tax collectors. They're the exact opposite of the sinners. They're religious. They're churchgoers. They dot their I's. They cross their T's. They said, you know what? I go to church. I give money. I go to a small group. I read my Bible. I pray. I do all the things I ought to do. I don't do the things I shouldn't do. And they felt like they made them better than everybody else. And I'm going to be very transparent and honest. I've had to battle that attitude myself. I've looked down at people who maybe do things I would never do, or who have done things that I have never done. And I never said it out loud, but in my heart there was this smug little attitude that said, I'm so glad I'm not a sinner like you. I'm so glad I never stepped into that cow dung that you stepped into. I'm so glad I've never stooped myself to do what you have done. And I used to think, now the best thing I can do is just, man, stay away from those kind of people. And just don't ever cross paths with them. And I now realize those are the very people we need to seek out. Because listen to how Jesus answered the Pharisees. Listen to what he says. And Jesus answered them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And I'm going to tell you, you're talking about just ripping their heart out. Because you know what Jesus said, and this is why it made them so angry. You know what Jesus just said to that religious crowd? He said, you religious fanatics are farther from God than the people that you think are farthest from God. you are farther from God than the people that you think are farthest from God. See, there are two kinds of people in this story. If you'll look, you'll find there are two kinds of, by the way, there are two kinds of people in this. If you're a missing person, if you've never committed your life to Christ, you do not have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ, you are one of two kinds of people. And this is why you're not a follower. There are two groups of people. There were the people who thought Jesus was too good for them. That's Levi. And then there were the people that thought they were too good for Jesus. That was the Pharisees. If you're here this morning, you're in one of two groups. If you've never become a follower of Jesus, it's either because you think Jesus is too good for you, which, oh, by the way, he is, or you think you're too good for him. Wake up call, you're not. The first group becomes followers, the second group become failures. Because let me tell you the good news. You ready for this? There's only one qualification to become a follower of Jesus, only one. You have to be a sinner. You say, that's it? Then I'm in. Yeah, we're all in. I get that. I mean, let me tell you why. If you're not a sinner, then you don't need to follow Jesus because you don't need Jesus. And I want to tell you something. The number one reason I have found why people don't come to Jesus is because they don't see themselves as being spiritually sick in need of a doctor. They don't see themselves as a sinner in need of a Savior. So the bottom line is this, is real simple. Okay, who is invited to follow Jesus? Who? Everyone. I know what you're saying. But I have a sexual past. You're invited. I've been divorced 3 times. You're invited. I have a jail record. You're invited. I'm a recovering alcoholic. You're invited. I'm a pothead. I'm a porn addict. I'm a prostitute. I'm a fornicator. I'm a hypocrite. You're invited. Because everyone is invited to follow Jesus, and anybody can. So, you need to understand, and I'm going to close this up. If you decide you want to follow Jesus, I just want to give you fair warning that Jesus expects the same response from everybody who makes the decision, yeah, I want to follow you. Go back to verse 28. And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. Now, I want to be honest. I'm not trying to brag on myself. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make a point. There's a lot of preachers that would skip that part. I can't do that. What it is what it is. You read it right. Levi left everything. And Levi lost everything when he followed Jesus. And you may be sitting there right now saying, I figured that. And you know, Pastor, that's why I'm not so sure Jesus is for me. I got a pretty good thing going over here, and I'm not sure I want to leave any of that or all of that to follow Jesus. Well, if you don't mind me just kind of imposing on you just for a moment, before you make that call, can I just say one other thing to you? Following Jesus will cost you everything. But refusing to follow Jesus will cost you more. For example, let's run the tape back. Jesus says to Levi, Levi, follow me. Levi says, man, just built the condo on the sea. Just bought the Mercedes Chariot. Just got these brand new Gucci sandals. Got the Rolex sundial in my backyard. You know, Lord, I don't think so. Appreciate the invitation. Think I'll pass. If he had done that, he probably would have died a filthy rich man. But we've never heard of him. And 2,000 years later, I wouldn't be talking about him. we wouldn't even know who he is. But because he said, I think I'll take you up on that offer, Jesus changed his name to Matthew, which, by the way, means gift from God. He went on to write a book in the Bible that people are reading 2,000 years later. People still name their sons after him. And when I was writing this message out, God gave me a thought, and I want to confess to you. Sometimes everybody has to battle pride every now and then. When this thought came to me, I said, boy, that's good. That's just good. I'm sorry, I'm just confessing this is good. Here's a thought that came to me. The best this world has to offer you is trash compared to the worst Jesus can give you. The best this world has to offer you is trash compared to the worst that Jesus can give you. And I'm just telling you, I am so glad every day I wake up, I am so glad to know everybody should be invited to follow Jesus. Anybody that wants to can. And I am so glad I have.
The more we look at our sin, the more we tend to pull away God. But when we focus on Him, we see His grace and mercy and want to run to Him. Don't waste another day hiding from God. Call Touching Lives today at 800-413-1131. We want to pray with you as you leave the old you behind. Every person without God is a missing person. Jesus spent the 3 most important years of his life doing 2 things: finding missing persons and making committed disciples. Of all of the things he could have done, he gave his life to those 2 things. And he wants us to do the same. Find out how simple it is to follow Jesus' example by sharing the good news with those who don't know him yet with the series Missing Person. Order your copy today at touchinglives.org or call 800-413-1131. CDs $20, DVDs $35. Once a missing person is found and makes a commitment to Christ, it's important for the disciple process to begin. Joining a fellowship of believers is key, along with spending time in the Word and learning from sound biblical teachings. Through your faithful prayers and financial support, the ministry of Touching Lives continues to disciple believers all around the world.
Touching lives.